Hey everybody, Mick is here. Hi. Uh, Now in these past vlogs that we've had, we've discussed developmental trauma and attachment ruptures between parent and child during childhood, along with some other things that had to do with what we call complex trauma or developmental trauma is what it's known as. Today, we're going to discuss shame, S-H-A-M-E, shame, and how it develops, what it looks like. Namely, the shame that we're going to talk about is unconscious. I'll refer to it as unconscious shame, pathological shame, toxic shame. It's what basically develops for those who have had maladaptive or dysfunctional developmental periods during childhood, okay? For those who haven't experienced a secure or nurturing childhood through abuse, neglect is big. Not validating is a good way to understand neglect. Not ignoring, not paying attention, mistreatment. Our brains, they wire up in such a particular pattern of this hypersensitivity, okay? And we react in an unhealthy manner. This all is below the level of conscious awareness, okay? That's the shame we're talking about. And I'll explain the other type of shame that everybody's familiar with and compare the two and then contrast them a little bit. As we grow and become adults now, this whole how we develop and what we err or what we become, when we grow up and we make mistakes or once become the focus of criticism or unhealthy attention, it affects us deeply, okay? And without realizing, our brain's threat areas, and we're going to talk about the limbic system, it's where fear is at, what we call it the threat areas. They'll respond in certain ways, what we call fight, flight, freeze, or flag. Okay, I'll explain those in a little more detail. So what happens is the most innocuous provocation that occurs can send us into these states of our threat cycle inside our brain activating when they shouldn't, okay? Especially if that focus is on us when it shouldn't be. And that's all that is what I call the unconscious shame of it. Like I said, other psychologists refer to it as toxic shame or pathological shame, okay? And I'll use all that interchangeably. But first, I want to let everybody know there's a difference between guilt and shame. It's different. Guilt is different from shame. Guilt is basically feeling of having committed or omitted an action or behavior toward others or something. Usually guilt is based on cultural or societal norms or mores. Essentially, it's a feeling that has this external, is outside of us, an external meaning, okay? But we feel it, you don't feel it internally, okay? We feel bad about it. If I do something like it's a commission, okay, or if I fail to do something on a mission that negatively affects another, a feeling of guilt may arise from my behavior or act of or lack of acting out. Okay, guilt also, the difference is between shame. It involves acts of penitence or contrition. Okay, I'm gonna try to make up for it if I feel guilty or I'll feel really, really bad about it. I have this, this contrition. I'll be contrite. So we can say that the difference between guilt and shame is it hinges on a triggering behavior or attribute. The difference between guilt and unconscious, toxic, pathological shame is guilt will hinge on a triggering behavior or an attribute of the person. So we can think of many examples to, when we feel guilty, and then this shame, which this small s that we do when we have a behavior in public that's based on norms or mores or customs. When we break those, we'll feel guilty about it, and we'll try to do something to make up for it. And with shame, when something embarrassing happens, we want to go bury our heads in the sand, go find a way to hide, right? But with unconscious shame, we don't have that. We will act out in unhealthy behaviors. So this toxic shame, it'll focus generally on feelings of the self, self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence, or even self-concept. Okay. So I hope you see the two differences between what I call a big S, and that's the chronic. It's chronic, it's pathological, it's toxic, and it's unconscious. And the small s, when we go do something that we're embarrassed about, we feel ashamed of, right? So this shame that we're going to discuss is this big S. It's an internal phenomenon. It's an internal sense of how we generally are, day in and day out. This type of shame connects directly with our feelings of self-worth, as I mentioned. Unconscious shame it can measure or define how we feel about ourselves. This feeling and type of shame tends to be intense and overpowering because it invokes a sense of being bad, worthless, or contemptible. Pathological shame is frequently associated with a sense of powerlessness, as well as sensations of shrinking, feeling small, feeling exposed, and desiring to disappear. And we're going to talk about how that works with the fight, flight, freeze, or flag, what I just talked about. Okay. People who experience shame, they evaluate their sense of self as basically, fundamentally flawed. There's something fundamentally flawed about them. There's something rotten and festering inside, which we feel, believe it or not, others are aware of and can see that we are contemptible, that we are worthless. But I'm going to describe how we respond to those in different ways, and I'll connect that for you. And you'll be able to sort of recognize it in the behaviors. So I hope this vlog is educational in that way. Hopefully some of you guys are making that connection with how you were treated as a child or as an adolescent growing up. During childhood, you were ignored, felt you were always in the way, or problem to others. Sort of this rejected feeling, this rejected sense. Not because you actually were, but that's what you were told and treated as such. This stays with us, buried deeply the rest of our lives. And if it's not dealt with properly, it comes out in such an uglier fashion. And we try to protect ourselves. Remember, I said it automatically triggers the fear network, okay? So this threat. And what will happen, shame and fear, they share the same connections in the brain here in the limbic system, which is, neuroscientists found it's really, and neuropsychologists and psychiatrists felt, that's really strange that shame and the threat network have the same components neurologically. and will respond by either a fight, a flight, a freeze, or a flag. And I'll explain those, and I'll try to give you examples of that, okay? I've told you that shame can be either a conscious awareness, to where we do something embarrassing, or it can be an unconscious state. And this unconscious state, it'll unknowingly, it predisposes us to thinking, feeling, or behaving in certain dysfunctional ways. With conscious shame, there typically is a feeling of humiliation that we can tie to an action or an inaction. Okay, I want you to see that difference between pathological, unconscious, toxic shame and the small s shame that we kind of all know about. Someone may say, "I feel ashamed," the small s, for having done that, or "I feel ashamed for not acting appropriately in that." Okay. So that small s shame is that conscious shame. It's what we refer to as in the moment shame. It's fleeting. It's ephemeral. It sort of wisps away. It only lasts temporarily, and then we forget about it, and then we get over it. Now, contrastingly, unconscious shame and what I call, toxic shame or pathological shame, it comes from growing up and being told or being treated as worthless, substandard, or defective in some way or another. We can probably all think of some ways it occurred in unhealthy ways. For some, it's a lot more than for others have been treated that way. Okay. Also, being neglected, okay, being ignored, tells the infant, the child, or adolescent that they're not valued or they don't have worth. They're not worth the time of the caregivers. Now, what you know, and I'm not going to talk about this, but it's what we call intergenerational. It's passed from parent to child, grandparent to parent to child, okay? And 4 generations sometimes. But this developmental trauma that we call the big T. But it sends us implicit message. These actions or inactions by the caregiver develops into this toxic pathological shame. It gets wired up permanently in our cortical regions, during development. Now, we'll get into this a little bit more, but the adult who unknowingly has toxic shame buried deep, they'll act out. It influences their behavior. Like we said, either by responding in a fight, flight, freeze, or flag response. Because the emotion of shame has a tight cortical linkage to the fear or threat centers. I don't keep repeating this over, but I want you to know that. It's located in that limbic region of our brains, and it controls our behaviors. So understanding this, and from this vantage, I want to explain to you how people might act and their overall behavior, okay? When toxic shame is unknowingly a part of their life. When unconscious shame appears as a fight response, it won't, we can think of anger and stuff like that, but there's other things we really don't think about, and these are what we call overcompensation. Overcompensation reactions. That is a fight response. It's linked, okay? People who have unconscious pathological toxic shame in a fight response, they will overcompensate in some ways. In those that have that overcompensation fight response, it'll appear as those who gravitate toward perfectionism or to strive to show others they are exceedingly capable. We see excessive amounts of materialism, wealth, academic achievement, excessive fitness and health, or other extreme avenues. And this proves to the self and others that they are worthy and valued. Okay? So those things I listed can be considered as compensatory, overcompensatory actions. In these adults, we may witness what we call obsessive compulsive personality disorder or narcissistic personality. When we talk about obsessive compulsive personality disorder, we're referring to people who are very rigid and like things done a certain way. They are very, very fixated on detail. And then there's the narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm sure we may know a narcissist or two. I think it's around 15%, 12% people who have a narcissistic are on the scales for narcissistic personality disorder. But I want you to remember that the optimal words here are excessive behavior, okay? You know, we're all narcissistic to a certain extent. But some who excessively shop, drinks alcohol, uses substance, will exercise, like using steroids while weightlifting. Some who may receive an overabundance of self-inflicted cosmetic surgeries. Some who you've been around, they talk exceedingly or excessively. There are workaholics, they overwork. Others may seek a lot of medical attention. And my favorite is there's those ones that are always on the go when they're not required to be. They just can't settle. They keep moving. Now, these may be some examples for you to know that maybe recognize. But just remember, exceedingly, something that's very excessive, okay? And everything that I described to you, they can be considered self-promoting behaviors that we may see in the narcissist, okay? It's those excessive behaviors that seem beyond the normal scope of relaxation, entertainment, or necessity. These behaviors may point to this condition, internal, deep, unconscious, pathological, toxic shame, okay? So that's the fight, where I just talked about, the flight. In the flight actions or behaviors, what we'll see is we'll see avoiding tendencies. They run away. They diminish things, or they dismiss it or ignore it. And I'll explain this to you later. I'll give you an example how somebody in this flight response will diminish or dismiss, okay? Individuals in this category, they tend to change jobs frequently, hopping job to job. They'll move households more than normal, or they have associates, a lot of associates, versus having really close friends. Social media, a lot of people will have just an inordinate amount of friends on social media when they've never met. So in this category, when they do have close relationships, though, they tend to be standoffish, superficial, and never showing or allowing their mate any sort of closeness, not getting close to that, okay? All right. Freezing. Now, when we talk about the freezing or flag condition, this is a dissociative condition. And we can see an inert or dormant sense of personality. Inert, I hope I'm saying that right. Sort of this moratorium on living. This moratorium sense is projected by the individual, okay? it comes, you'll see it projected at them. It's like their life is in a pause. They view life from a negative or glass half empty attitude. It's a standard tactic. Their thoughts aren't not if something bad will happen, but when that bad will happen. They really don't give up, okay? But they seem stoically content with a lower standard of living, or seem acceptant of their deprivation or life's hardships. Some may revel in their misery or misfortune, wearing it like a badge of honor. Their quest is to maintain status quo, which can be uncomfortable in harsh conditions. These life experiences are accepted as a form of a learned helplessness. Okay? Learned helplessness is when you had something bad happen over and over. It's shocked that was the dogs, and they wouldn't jump over the glass when they could escape. Even though they're able to escape it, they stay within that deprivated condition. Okay, they'll be indecisive, scared. If they make the wrong decision, they'll be ridiculed. So this is for the people in that freezer flag. Okay. Now these aren't standalone categories. It's not that simple. These 3 or 4 conditions that I told you about, at times they can mesh. They can come together and they can coalesce. Sort of this amalgamation of dysfunction, if you will, in that sense. Okay. Someone may start an argument. So for somebody for flight, and they abruptly leave when they're being bested. Here's an example. Or somebody who has a fight in them might get louder as a way of trying to win. They will verbally attack instead of staying on topic. Or during a discussion that gets too close and personal, they flag. This is something they flag by talking about other things than what we're talking about if it's uncomfortable. Or they'll switch to another subject that doesn't pertain to the topic we're on, or somebody else that's relevant to the conversation. I see this a lot in session. They change the focus away from themselves, okay? So criticism for all these 3 groups is like daggers to their personality. And what is witnessed is that this fight, flight, freeze, or flag response to perceive criticism. A normal person may not take that as criticism, but these people with deep embedded shame, they have this really sensitive nature, and something that's not critical, they can perceive it as such. Some people with this pathological shame, they will unknowingly project criticism as a defensive mechanism on another. Okay, because of the buried shame, they tend to criticize or ridicule others as a way of what we label defensive projection. So it's a defensive mechanism of projection. Sometimes in passive-aggressive ways, they'll do this by making others the brunt of the joke, or teasing to condescend others. Okay, the words tend to point out flaws or the mistakes of others instead of highlighting their accomplishments. They tend to accent the negative and dismiss the positive. Also, people with unconscious shame may tend to promote themselves in either a positive light or in a negative, self-deprecating way, which I kind of talked about previously. So, and I want to tell you, there's 2 kinds of narcissism. There's pathological, the narcissism, which we call grandiose narcissism, the one who always brags and makes themselves the center of attention. Well, also they're what we call the vulnerable narcissists. They want to be at the center of attention, but what they do is they use the woe is me narrative in their life to tell others. And instead of bragging about what great accomplishments they've had, they want the attention and focus on them, and they do it by talking about life's slings and arrows. If you've ever been with someone or with a group of people, and I'm gonna give you an example here. So if you've ever been with someone, a group of people, and let's say you're recounting a recent trip, like a mountain retreat or maybe a cruise, and instead of delighting in your story, they interrupt and they recall their experiences. What I call the one-upmanship. Now this is the grandiose form, okay? Meaning, they'll say, well, yeah, I've been there several times, or they'll start telling you or the group of their exploits, leaving your experience and your story flat, just changing the topic from you to them. They always seem to have this, they've done what you've done, or they have what you have, sometimes to a greater extent. And sometimes the tactic is for them to embellish or to fabricate for this one-upmanship, what I call fabulous. They'll make stuff up to appear knowledgeable or more important than they actually are. They want others to view them in a positive light, okay? And on the other side, the vulnerable narcissists, they'll self-deprecate and present themselves as victims, this learned helplessness. And they don't know, neither of them know that they're behaving in this manner, but other people recognize it because their shame is deep and it's not conscious. They'll say and do things which self-promote. They become the topic of attention, like I say, either by grandiose tactics or self-deprecating expressions. It's self-deprecating is the woe is me vocabulary in order to receive that attention, okay? So, all right. We're going to talk about the etiology, the cause of toxic pathological shame. Where does it come from? Especially the unconscious form, which the person, they're not aware of, nor will they admit to it. These feelings are repressed. Freud talked about repression. It's a state that's buried deep, and it causes our behaviors to come out and be enacted in unhealthy ways. The dysfunctional situations which develop from this state, they're accepted as fate, as a matter of fact occurrence. Carl Jung, he was an associate of Freud's. It's spelled Jung, but it's pronounced Jung. Once said that when we keep the unconscious and dysfunctional realities buried, either by repression or denial, okay? When we keep these unconscious and dysfunctional realities buried, either by repression or denial, negative circumstances will present themselves as a product of life. Life's vicissitudes, I guess you could say, to be repeated over and over and over, unwittingly by the individual. Not only do we cause these fateful occurrences, but we're cursed to repeating them throughout our lives. Now, this is something to think about. We don't know it. We think it's fate, something that's outside the self-agency. Something that's outside of our control, self-agency. Thus, it's normal, okay? But it's not. It really isn't. This is my favorite part here. Where did shame, so how did it come about in human history? the first recorded instance of shame is acted out in the Garden of Eden. I find it amazing how today's neurological studies, they denote the same areas of shame and fear, that threat area of the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the HPA, and I'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. How all of that is wired up, it's the same. That's shame is interlinked. It's the same neurological cortical network. And they're closely related in that limbic system of our brain. This very same phenomenon is actually mentioned in the beginning of Genesis. It really is. We're going to do what's called a little, what's known as in media res. It's Latin for like in the middle of action, or in the heart of it. So Adam and Eve, they've already eaten the forbidden fruit, and God, he comes searching for them, remember, in the garden? And they're hiding. El Shaddai, which is the physical manifestation of God, Christ, El Shaddai, calls out, "Where are you?" And Adam answers him, "We're hiding." So this this question-answer phase, it happens where we learn that Adam and Eve were hiding because they were afraid, okay, out of fear. They're hiding for fear. And Adam said they were fearful because they were ashamed. Okay, shame came first, then the fear, then the behavior of avoidance. But there's more to it. And I'll get to that here shortly. But 6,000 years ago, Hebrew writers, okay, 6,000 years ago, they connected this shame as a product of fear. But that's not all. They also recorded the defensive mechanism of projection and displacement. See, Adam blamed God and Eve. Adam says, it was the fault of the woman that you gave me. So not only did he blame Eve, but he blamed God. So he's projecting his shame on the others and displacing his anger away from himself. Eve, she then blames the serpent, but she keeps her shame to herself. Now, I don't know about you, but as a Christian and as a scientist, that is beyond coincidence to me, to have that connection that I see and how to explain it. Of course, they didn't know neurologically what went on in the brain like we know today, which is really not complete. It's far from complete. But, the rest is history in that sense. Now, let's turn to how the unconscious toxic shame develops in the infant and is later repeated, by using dysfunctional projection, what I talked about, and displacement, and there's other maladaptive defensive mechanisms too, with this, but and this happens during adulthood. Simply stated, what projection is, it's something that unconsciously is not liked about oneself and introjected into another. So I don't like something about myself, and I will blame them and internally inject it. They have that problem. And then displacement is anger directed at a non-offending target. They have really nothing to do with it. The spouse had a bad day at work, boss, gets on to them, and they come home and they take their anger out on the family, okay? So that's projection and displacement. And those are defensive mechanisms. They're unhealthy. And we see that with people with toxic shame. Now, our parents, they're our main caregivers. So if someone grows up in a dysfunctional household full of anger, physical, or even emotional abuse, childhood sexual trauma, substance or alcohol abuse, neglect, or maltreatment by being told that they're substandard, they won't amount to anything, that they're less than others, etc. You know, this environment is swallowed and digested on a daily basis, but it's not eliminated from the body. Okay, it is this ugly sort of energy. It's poisonous. It gets put into our bodies and it stays there. Right? And it becomes cumulative in the sense that it's like mercury or like radiation. Okay, poison. It becomes deadly. It does over time. It just builds on itself until it comes to a point where it becomes critical. You know, we have this thing called prodromal phase, you know, where it goes through the phases and boom, it becomes critical. So it's prodromal type creeping that occurs. This toxin, it forever stays in the system, okay? And it continuously activates the fear, threat regions of our brain. Now, fear, threat, remember, is also linked to the shame part of it, this toxic pathological shame. And it gets wired up in a strong and sensitive fashion. Situations, you know, that are innocent or innocuous are interpreted and perceived as threatening. You know, we talked about that. There's anything that you know, potentially we wouldn't think of, you know, normal people. I wouldn't say, I use normal very in a very extended fashion, okay? But it's very strong and sensitive to them. And this is because when I talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA is what we normally call it. It's kind of a mouthful. It's your hypothalamus, it's your pituitary, and it's your adrenal glands. Now, adrenal, it sits on top of your kidneys. Okay, ad means on top, and renal, of course, is your kidneys. So this adrenal axis in our central and peripheral nervous systems is activated during these perceived threats. Sometimes they're perceived, releasing adrenaline, HTCH, cortisol, and it lifts us up. Now this feeling, we can all remember and know what this feeling of getting revved up is like. From there, like I said, we'll either hit the fight, flight, freeze, or flag sort of occurrence, which means, you know, this flag means we check out and we disassociate. You know, we depersonalize, we get off of derealization. You know, we're not in the moment, okay? And it depends on what they use for one's history, you know, whether it's fight, overcompensation, and things like that. These higher than normal amounts of neuroendocrine chemicals and hormones that come crashing in over time, and they have this deleterious effect, you know, on our bodies. Heart conditions, immune irregularity, cancers, cluster headaches, back problems, or other psychosomatic illnesses, okay? Now, I'm not saying when I say psychosomatic illnesses, I'm not saying it's all in our heads. These symptoms and conditions are real. They are physiologically present. They are formed and encouraged by our heightened sympathetic nervous system, okay? This slow, constant boil, it's a real slow, real simmering, constant boil inside of us. It attenuates our bodily defenses, or weakens our immune system over time. Because, you know, unknowingly, we are fighting these toxins of unconscious shame. You know, we're responding to them by fight, flight, freeze, or flag, okay? I want you to remember what I'm going to say here, and I sometimes use this in session with clients, is that biography becomes biology, okay? Meaning our early environment, whether healthy or unhealthy, changes our genetic coding and brain connections, either in a good or bad way. Biography, how we get raised, how we go through life, our development becomes biology. And then I add to it, and it begets behavior. And we talked about those behaviors. But there's good news, okay? I'm getting ready to wrap this up. With professional help, we can change the brain's wiring in adulthood. This is called plasticity. Okay, it's plastic, it's plasticity. We can actually develop new connections, stronger connections, and weaken those other connections that are deleterious to us, okay? They're caustic in our brains. We can weaken those with a competent therapist who's been trained in interpersonal neurobiological approaches, which I just kind of, it just explains how your brain works and how the behavior and how you're part of your brain, okay? And by highlighting these attachment cues, the connections that you have in therapy, these automatic changes can occur in our adult brains. Even when we're 90 years old, research and science has shown us this. So this shame, it'll always be there. I want you to understand that. But if you get treated for it with, the competent, somebody trained in these areas, you can get it reduced to a lesser extent, to where it doesn't always come out, okay? And it will come out, but it won't be as unhealthy in that. As a Christian counselor and psychologist, I tell my Christian clients that Christ does not promise to fix us, okay? He doesn't promise to fix us. He promises to save us. And what he does is to fix us, he uses people. There's an old adage that God uses man and man uses systems, okay? So just think about that. And I want you to know counseling, it's a system used by man. Today, we know somewhat about the brain function and how healthy involvement in therapy can help ameliorate past issues. And so I encourage you to seek out and get help if you're suffering or having problems with relationships or something that may inform that, especially relationships. And even, job and employment, what I described earlier, job to job, moving, you're always on the move, you're always busy. Encourage those that are having these problems. If it's not you, talk to them. Be careful what you say, okay? Because I told you they'll perceive it as a slight, and they're easily triggered. These aforementioned symptoms, they're clear indicators that something is amiss. So don't be like Adam and point the finger at God, your spouse, or others. My grandmother, she used to say, Mickey Lynn, when you point a finger at someone else, 3 are pointing back at you, okay? So, look, if you would like more information, if you want to reach out to me, just private message me or email me at agapecounselor@outlook.com. Agape, A-G-A-P-E, agape counselor @outlook.com, okay? And everything is confidential. So, Happy New Year. God bless you. And see you next time.